Super inspirational story here. We've got a guy who's 36 years old and he has traveled to 85 countries. He has a 6-property portfolio and he is pretty much retired. He's done it. He's packed his bags and he's now traveling off the income that he has from his property portfolio. And this is some of the inspirational stuff that I love to hear because everyone's got a different goal. For this guy, it's to travel every single country in the world and meet incredible people and have amazing stories to tell. Being 36 and being able to build a property portfolio to sustain him to be able to do this is absolutely incredible. And he's Kiwi born and well, doesn't live in Australia anymore. He's traveling the world. Did live in Australia. He's purchased properties in Australia, purchased properties in New Zealand. And this is an investor story. He's got nothing to sell. He's just sat in Bali right now, living his best life. And he's like, guys, mate, I've done some pretty cool stuff. I'm actually living here. Yeah, you want to chat? And we were like, yes, absolutely. I reckon you got some pretty interesting stuff to share. But just his attitude and approach, also the way he was a little bit more strategic, the questions he asked himself to be able to build the property portfolios where I saw a whole heap of value. Hey everyone, my name's Joe Tucker and together with Jeff Miles, we created Oz Property Investors, Australia's largest property investment community. We have over 81,000 property investors and each week we interview top property experts from all walks of property life and Sam O'Connor is no different. We also have the Level Up Property course which teaches the people that step-by-step process so they can go out there and achieve financial freedom exactly like this dude has done. He's 36 years old, has 6 properties and he's fully retired. This is ridiculous. I love stories like this. If you are an investor and you've got a cool story like this, guys, reach out to us. We want to hear from you. But let's jump in. Let's rock and roll. Sorry, you bought in New Zealand first or Australia first?
Yeah, I bought in New Zealand. And then I moved to Australia in 2017 and I bought a few months after that.
Wow.
And originally what I did, and I think it's a common mistake people did, is I approached a bank directly, just thinking, oh, well, brokers,
They've got money.
Yeah. And what happened then, it was CBA Bank and they came back at, we can lend you 380,000. And then anyway, someone recommended I go to a broker, and obviously a broker doesn't cost as a purchaser. So I did it to them and they sort of moved things around. They said, look, like you should be including, I had a couple of flatmates in, and they said, well, you should be including your flatmates as an income, even though you're not the owner, you're still receiving this income. So the broker, my serviceability went from 380 to maybe 600,000.
That's a very creative lending going on there because you must have I don't know, maybe things have it's just interesting they allowed you to do that. I mean, that might have not necessarily been. Well, I suppose it's more around. You could argue that you're not paying the full. Maybe reduce your expenses, or did it increase your income?
Yeah. And the broker had some good other points. There was things like, like I was doing sort of ATM cash withdrawals, and he just said, "Stop that." They don't know.
No. That's a huge red flag because you kind of it looks like you might be going down to the pokies and gambling away. If that was just kind of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and at one stage, I said, look, if I moved into my friend's house and lived there rent free, what would help that increase my serviceability? And it increased it like $60,000. And if people are willing to take the sacrifice, you can. It's probably easier to purchase than you think, but you do need to make some sacrifices, especially if it's your first purchase.
Yeah, it's I chatted to someone about that as well, of like how I'm sick of. I'm sorry to say I've chatted to someone about that, but it's every time you say something, I'm like, oh yeah, that's exactly. But you don't realize how much you can sacrifice until you have a reason why to sacrifice it, right? Like one of I got a new job, a couple of years back, more than a couple of years back. And I was like, I need my salary to be high and I don't want commissions so that I can go ahead and buy property. Like everything was I was doing everything in my life to get property investing, to get it going. Like there's somebody at work right now. There's probably someone at work right now watching this and they're working their ass off and it's 8 p.m. at night. But they're like too scared to go to the boss but you could go to the boss and ask for an extra $10,000, like, and say,
Yeah.
Mr. Boss, you need it. Like, I'm working so hard right now. I'm doing this. This is why you need to pay me more. And if they say no, great, change job, move, get more money, get more income, which is then going to give you more serviceability, which is then going to allow you to lend more, which is then going to allow you to get more investment properties to then eventually be able to do something like what Sam's doing.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You've got income,
yeah.
you've got income and expenses. And incomes can be a little bit harder to increase. But I've always sort of like brought things and sold things online and brought cars or whatever. If you're really wanting to hustle to save for a deposit, there is things you can do. I mean, you can always do a second job. I mean, I'm not saying work yourself to death, but if you're willing to work on a Sunday between say 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. to 10 p.m., you're probably going to be on, in most places in Australia, $30 to $40 an hour. Yeah. And then, I've always, when I'm starting out, I've always lived with flatmates to keep my rent down. A lot of my friends, they're like, oh, I don't want to live with anyone else. Well, I'm like, okay, well, if you're in Sydney or Melbourne, you're probably paying $500 or $600 a week, So, I've typically cooked my own meals at home. I don't buy $8 coffees. I mean, I'm sounding like Tim Gurner now, but it's my point is there is some sacrifice starting off, and people come to me and say, oh, you're so lucky. But what they don't realize is there's many years where I was living pretty frugally, even now, I fly jets, I fly economy. I usually just fly whatever's cheapest, Jetstar, I don't give a crap, but other people are like, no, I only want to fly Qantas, or I don't like Jetstar. And I'm like, it's like value for money, and for me, it's even I'm in a position now, I probably could fly, business class if I wanted to. I just don't see it as value for money. So I think if you have that mindset of not being wasteful, then A, your expenses will decrease, or two, your income will go up.
The question that I actually have is New Zealand. You're Kiwi, so you can go ahead and buy there. Like, can I, Australian born, can I just go over there and buy investment properties? Like, what? Let's say I'm Australian. How do I go ahead and get these Kiwi properties?
Yeah, 100%. Look, I'm not. Yeah, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so I think anyone that's going to buy a property, if it's New Zealand, one Australia, there you go. Yeah, at the current time, and it has been for a number of years, is that New Zealanders and Australians, and I believe actually Singapore, weirdly enough, I don't know why, but they are all treated as citizens when it comes to buying property. So there's no restrictions. You don't need any government approvals or absolutely anything. You can just go and go to an auction or submit an offer on a property and buy it. I think you might need to set up maybe like a tax file number or something like that, which is reasonably easy to do. But in New Zealand, Australia, very, very lucky because that free trade agreement that's been in place a number of years.
The thing that scared me about Singapore, like you're buying an apartment for, anyway, yeah, we'll talk about that another time.
Singapore investment now. But so actually we can just go ahead. So I've got an income in Australia. I can just go ahead and buy New Zealand property as if it's like going to, it was actually closer than WA. But that's how it works. I can just borrow the banks. They'll look at my income here and say, yeah, that's fine.
They seem to look at both incomes. My understanding is that the banks do scale it. They might say, okay, we're going to factor in 70%, and I think that's due to maybe currency fluctuations. But there's a lot of New Zealanders living in Australia, and there's not as many, but there's a few Australians living in New Zealand. But even if you're not living in the country, you can still borrow based on your incomes of either country.
That's definitely right. And of course, it's going to be different from banks because I was, when I was broking back in the day, we'd have a lot of New Zealanders coming over to Australia, but they'd be like, I want to buy a place to live. Can you pick me up a mortgage now? And the conversation was, it's much easier if you're earning in the currency. Let's just say if they're in New Zealand, they're earning Aussie dollars, wanting to buy in Australia, it's much easier because otherwise, and vice versa. Like if you're a Kiwi wanting to buy in New Zealand, but earning Aussie dollars, yeah, they do sort of shade it by typically sort of 10 to 20%, sometimes up to 30, but yeah, 10 to 20. So it can be challenging, but yeah.
And I think also my understanding is like CBA Bank owns a bank in New Zealand called ASB. So I think if you are planning to buy in New Zealand, maybe, talk to New Zealand mortgage broker or other professionals and find out what is the best way to build your credit up, because you might purposely want to actually open a mobile mobile phone account to build a credit score, just to show that you don't default on things, and open bank accounts, maybe a year or 2 years in advance, and get a card and use it just so that bank knows, some sort of history, that you've been with them.
How does it go with like disclosure of different assets and things in Australia? So I'm thinking, put the disclaimer up but no, I'm thinking like you've got a property, you're fully tapped out in Australia from a lending perspective because Australia won't lend you anything anymore. Like, is there a way to have a chat with someone in New Zealand and you might not have to mention your trusts or your other properties or your other things? Like, have you heard of that happening?
Yeah, look, what is interesting is the banks on either side don't actually verify the assets that you own in the other country. They don't actually look up, the government database. I've always been really transparent just because I've never wanted to ruin a relationship with a bank. I probably could not disclose a certain expense or a mortgage or whatever, but I've always just been like, if you burn a lender, then you're probably going to be blacklisted for life, if that's such a thing. So I've always just wanted to be honest from that perspective. There is some gray areas. I've had friends sort of maybe not disclose something. It's not because they didn't want to disclose, it's just they weren't asked to disclose it, right? So I think the other thing is, like, if a lender is asking for information, I only give them what they ask. I don't volunteer more information. I'm not going to tell them that I'm hungover right now because I partied last night in Bali, right? Because why would you volunteer that? It's not a good look. That's why I'm sweating, by the way, because it's hot.
That's interesting you say that, because you are like, the moment there is any sniff that there might be something there, where there's smoke, there's fire. So if you aren't going to do that, if there's any sort of trail or any sort of payment on the bank statement that a lender sees, they'll sort of accredit as soon as they ask the question. If you can't come up with a good answer for it, then it can be an automatic decline. So you just have to be very careful on your paperwork and dotting your I's, crossing your T's.
And also just how you structure it. Say you're wanting some help from your parents. Say your parents will give you 50,000 towards a deposit on your first property or multiple properties, whatever it may be. Rather than get that 50,000 as, say, a loan, which is the liability which you have to disclose. If you get your parents to technically say it's a gift, and then you verbally say, look, I'll pay you back at some point in the future. They go, yeah, it's fine, whatever. It's not a legal contract or anything. So if it's a gift, the banks are going to not see that as a debt, and that's going to make your purchasing power better. So I think it's good to always do things legally, but you can be a little bit crafty to structure in the best way that's going to get you the most finance.
Said, can you walk? I know you said some of the research you do was you go and you actually kind of understand what's going on in the area from a development and how much is being developed. What are the sort of, do you follow much of the data? Like, what is that? So you look at days on market? Do you look at vacancy rates, all that sort of jazz? Or what are the key takeaways that you look out for?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I do is the family trust, there's probably been like 56 purchases that I've done with them, and then myself have done 6. So I've done, a lot of due diligence on different properties. And I think the first thing is to spend as little as possible to start with. If you're gonna submit an offer on a property, don't go spend $10,000 on builders reports and everything else. Like, get your finance first, right? So when I'm looking at a property, typically it's like, obviously what you mentioned, the occupancy or the vacancy rates, rents in the area, is market rent. What would market rent be if it was vacant tomorrow? Looking at infrastructure projects in the region, different subsidies as well, different areas. Like New Zealand at the moment, they'll give you a subsidy if you take in social housing clients. They'll pay maybe double as much their market rent if you're willing to take on these tenants. So looking at where value can be added. I know Australia it's big, like the whole granny flat situation. I'm a big fan of that. I reckon there's just so many success stories of people buying and putting a granny flat on, and all of a sudden it's like a 20% yield or 15% yield. What I mentioned earlier, like changing the floor plans where I can add value through renovation. What else? I mean, obviously every region's different, and like this year I'm looking at all regions, and sometimes it can be really hard to understand because you only got to have one street that's bad, and 3 streets over it's really good, and unless the area, it can be very tricky. And I think that's where talking to agents and valuers and building a bit of a team around you. Even accountants and lawyers, like I've never been scared to spend money on lawyers. I've always found them good value for money. People go, I hate paying $400 an hour. I'm like, they're great, right? They can look through the title. Is there any easements on it? Is there covenants of some type? Is there been building issues? A lot of properties now have got unconsented works, and you only need one complaint from a neighbor, then you got to rip out that second kitchen, or you got to remove that granny flat, or whatever it may be. So I've always been a fan of, once I've done my own personal due diligence, which is just your basic, growth and yield and quality of the property, then engage the lawyers, and they do that really fine print, and especially with strata, like I sold a property actually in September, settled in January this year in Sydney. And the buyers, I was shocked just how little due diligence they're wanting to do. Like some of them didn't, no building and pest inspection, no strata report, like they had no idea whether there was special levy coming up. And so I've always done that, where like, especially for strata properties, is getting a building and pest inspection a strata report, getting them to look through every single AGM meeting for the last 10 years. Is there any structural issues? Is there issues where, like I saw one the other day where it was used as an Airbnb. It was like a super high yield, and I was like, man, this is good. Looked at the strata minutes. They, at the last AGM, they had voted that the next following year Airbnb would not be allowed. So it sounds, initially you look at it, you're like, man, it's good yield. But if you hadn't read that strata AGM, your yield would be gone. I was just going to mention, even with the lawyers, don't. I've always scrutinized the lawyers too. Like I'd actually look through it myself.
Yes.
Don't just rely 100% on the lawyers. Point something out and say, look, because they, there might be a stormwater pipe, and they might just say, oh, that's very normal. Well, another one is like when I brought in Sydney, my first purchase actually. I got the strata, not the building inspection report, and it said, oh, there's asbestos. And I freaked out. I thought, don't even touch it, asbestos. My lawyer said, look, about 40% of apartments in Sydney have asbestos. It's so common, it's not funny. It's only if you cut it open, it becomes an issue. So, I think it's doing your own research, but also don't be scared of using professionals, valuers and particularly lawyers. Planners quite often, they'll give you free advice. They say, look, I want to change this to a 2-bedroom to a 4-bedroom. Here's a walkthrough video. Get the agent to take a video. Do you think it would be possible? And they go, yes or no. And they go, structural beams, just don't even touch it. And they go, otherwise, yep, it's not a problem. So a lot of people are willing to help out. Some even at no cost, as long as you do eventually use their services at some point. But I think it's best to spend a bit of money, and that will either save you a lot or add a lot of value. And another one is structures. Like I originally started purchasing in my own name, and then I soon clicked on, because I didn't want to pay an accountant. I didn't want to pay an accountant to give me advice. I just thought I'll buy my own name, and now I sort of learned that some people, it may be better to buy in trusts. Each property in a trust for serviceability purposes. So I think the due diligence isn't only in the actual property, but it's also the structure and the finance and everything like that.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point.
What are some of the mistakes, and what would you have done differently, Sam?
Yeah, probably the first thing is something's better than nothing. Eventually, obviously don't buy the absolute worst case, but I think don't aim for the dream place number one. Like if you're eastern suburbs Sydney or beachfront, is it the best parts of Melbourne or whatever it may be, you don't need to buy, you don't need to live in the property. It can purely be an investment property. I still don't own my own house, so people were like shocked. They're like, oh, well, where's your house? Like, I don't have a house. I still rent. When I go back to Australia, I rent, and rent investor, and it's becoming more common. Probably just that, like we mentioned on before, this paying for that advice from the start with lawyers, particularly the structure, the ownership. Do you buy in your own name? Do you buy in a trust or a company? I think I probably would have done that differently. And there's advantages, obviously buying in your own name, there's a lot of advantages. You're not paying first, stamp duty if you're a first home buyer and things like that. And so I think, I probably would have done that a bit more. I would have taken a bit more risk. There's probably areas that I thought, I'm not going to go in there because it's rough. Well, a lot of these rough areas over 5 or 10 years become quite good. The other one is not discounting the areas that have had no growth. Like I regret not buying in Gold Coast. I remember, maybe only 6 or 7 years ago, apartments for 250,000. And I just thought, man, it's just so good, but it's had no growth for 12 years. And, you know, I would have probably taken a bit more risk and brought in markets that maybe it is not seen as so desirable or haven't had such a good track history.
Logan, for example, mate,
Yeah.
Logan, you could have picked
yeah.
up a house that's now doubled and some.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. There's such great points. The other point that I would just like to make on the professional side of things when it comes to trusts and structuring, just know everyone has a bias toward their profession regarding trusts and structuring. So you just have to look at it from the lens at which that professional has it. So for me, it's get the free advice first from your broker, and your you then buyer's agent will give you some advice around that. But the broker cares about the structures because they want the best borrowing ability and serviceability to be able to get you into the next one, right? The accountant is looking at it from a trust perspective, from a tax perspective. Well, if you get a trust, you're not going to be able to minimize your tax. You're gonna not be able to get negative gearing benefits. And then the lawyer is looking at it from a protection standpoint of like, what happens if you get sued? So if you only look at one of those, and then the buyer's agent likes it because you can continue buying and going again. So kind of on the broker side of things. So just when you're having these conversations, try and it's hard to get everyone in the room at the same time, but bounce ideas off of everyone. Say, hey, I was chatting to my broker about trust, and he said that I need to get that from a borrowing capacity. What about from the accounting perspective? Oh, no, you're not going to get negative gearing. Cool. I've got two differing opinions on my head. Now I need to make the decision of, well, what should I do? And then go down the path that best fits you.
Great point.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.